Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 10th chapter in our AIA California Climate Action webinar series. I am Bob Murrin, FAIA, and I'm the AIA California Secretary Treasurer. And as you know by now, AIA California has been hosting a monthly climate action webinar series. All previous meetings, bonus sessions, and information on the final two webinars are available on the climate action portion of the AIA California website. A few housekeeping things to remember before we get started. Today's session, which qualifies for AIA Continuing Education Credit, will be recorded and shared on the AIA California website. Additional resources and a PDF of the presentation will also be available. As a reminder, using the question and answer box in the lower or upper menu bar of your Zoom window, feel free to type in questions for Illya to answer during the question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. And now on today's webinar, as you know, this webinar series is centered around each of the pillars of the AIA National Framework for Design Excellence. Design is not just about aesthetic components, but how buildings perform for people. The framework for design excellence is made up of 10 measures, formerly known as the COAT Top 10. It organizes our thinking, facilitates conversations with our clients and the communities we serve, and sets meaningful goals and targets for climate action. It's fitting that as your AIA California Treasurer, I have the opportunity to introduce today's webinar focusing on designing for the economy. When using the lens while looking at your next project, we'd like you to think about the good design, how good design adds value for owners, occupants, community, and the planet. Three things to consider. How do we provide abundance while living within our means? How will the design choices balance first cost with long-term value? And third, how can the performance of this project be improved in ways that are cost and design neutral? And now I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Illya Azaroff, AIA. Illya is associate professor at the New York City of Technology, CUNY, and is a founding principal of Plus Lab Architect PLCC, whose founding mission is to build resilient capacity and advance goals for the sustainable future through a collaborative network to uncover current issues relevant to architecture and the built environment, used materials, and the craft of building. He is internationally recognized leader in disaster mitigation, resilient planning and design strategies. Currently, he is part of a resilient housing task force under the auspices of HUD to create new federal guidance around resilient housing. Recently, he worked with Anchor and FEMA, developing community resilient benchmarking, as well as the hazard mitigation plans for the US Virgin Islands and New York City. He regularly works with the city, state, and federal agencies, professional societies, not-for-profits, community groups, and foreign governments on building resilient capacity. His office is advancing culturally significant community resilient hubs and resilient cluster housing developments under the guidance of several countries. He has worked in the field for over 25 years and is pleased to be serving as the new AIA President-elect for the state of New York in 2021. Welcome, Illya. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Bob. And it's great to be here today. I really appreciate AIA California Council asking me to take this on. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. And it's appropriate that we talk today a bit about economy. So I'm going to share my screen and we can get started. So today we're going to talk a little bit about economy. And in my office, and what I try to teach my students is that architecture practice centers around a few things. One is that we call this RARE. RARE is resilient architecture, regeneration, and equity. And we try to bring that into every project. And we often ask ourselves, what is our currency in this project? What is the client's currency? What is the community's currency? And so I'd like you to keep that in mind as we go forward. And even though we're a small office, we deliver projects all around the world. And we often talk about the fact that our office is quite small and we have more projects in time zones than we do employees. But that is how we collaborate. That's how we get out there to bring our expertise and add what we can to these projects and processes. And today I want to tell you a few stories. The few stories that we have with our projects, each one of those dots that you'd seen is a story. And from this image, I'm going to tell you a story about there to the upper left, where I'm standing with this lovely lady. And I'll tell you a little bit about that towards the end of today. And right below on the island of Dominica and some of the efforts that we've been working on there. And then, of course, the one in the middle, where we're cutting a beautiful ribbon, and tell you a little bit about that story and see if we can tease out some of these elements. But before we get started with those stories, I want to lay a few ground rules, some things that we believe in. One is that we believe that resilient communities are adaptive communities. Adaptive communities means that they're addressing something about time. I also have had great conversations with folks about this next point. Resilience is not resiliency. You have to think of resilience as an action, okay? And that is a fundamental piece of how we approach our work with communities in building a capacity around resilience, around these actions for making a better world, better communities. And that brings us to this last piece, which is the 4 dimensions of RARE. And I said that RARE is resilience, architecture, regeneration, and equity. That we look at scale. Scale and adaptation is not just the buildings, it's the complex networks that create our communities. Those include social networks, they include education networks, they include all kinds of inputs and variables. And location, but it's not just the physical location. Location, in my view, is always in a state of becoming. What does that mean? That means that all those networks I just described are constantly changing. So the location and its relationship to those networks is constantly becoming something new, and you have to realize that. You're also designing for all hazards. Those are natural and man-made, those shocks and stresses. Typically, we as human beings, we often look at the last disaster and respond to it or react to it. But we really need to look at things in a broader way and be all-inclusive. And then the last piece is time. And some of this is projecting forward using the best science, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. When you build something today or design something today, it is for tomorrow. If you're basing your design effort on the science of today, of who's living there today, you're missing the point. Our life cycle of buildings is 50 or 100 years. And so when you project forward, you have to really look at this aspect of time, including the science, but including population influx, change, all the things that might be coming down with those networks to really be responsive in your architecture. So that brings me to the story. So those are some of the things that we constantly discuss in the office, and we struggle with those. But I'm going to take you to our first story. Our first story is this story very close to home. And we often ask the question, how do we lead in a moment that needs change? And this is an adaptation of a coastal zone new construction in Breezy Point. This is our Hurricane Strong house. And you can hear the train behind me. But this is the location in the 5 boroughs. This very long peninsula, which is called the Rockaway Peninsula. It's part of Queens, New York, and surrounded on 3 sides by water. As a close-up, here's the community. It's a low-rise residential community that's been around for quite a long time, starting with a lot of informal housing that was only used for beach days. It was never winterized, and now it's become a much more formal community. And you can see that there's some blocks and areas that are quite empty. There's only a small portion of this that's really remained as a built-up area. I'm going to show you the original house. So this is Diane's original house, the house she grew up in, and she is our client. And she's the subject of this story, along with the house and all the people that helped put this thing together. And this house was built by her grandfather and father with a loan of $500 from the bank. Both of them happened to be engineers, and so it really was quite a lot of money back then. And building it themselves, this house stood the test of time up until Sandy. And in fact, you can see it's fairly intact. Sandy had a giant storm surge here. It was 12 feet high. So you can imagine how much of this house was underwater. But it survived. And it was only on later inspection that it was determined the underlying structural conditions would not allow this house to be saved. So we had to go about the next steps, replacing this house and replacing Diane's home where she lives. So there's Diane on the right, enabling her to go ahead and take a crack at taking the house down. And this is the beginning of our team. We have this idea of building back stronger. And sometimes you hear this often after disasters. And I know many of you in California are going through some serious issues currently with the fires. And all along the Gulf Coast, people are going through the most recent storms. And there's a lot of that going on, and more will be coming. And we often talk about building back better. Let's build back better. Hashtag build back better. But do we truly build back better? And this was the point that we were trying to make with Diane, and kind of looking at the programs that were from the federal government, supporting how we build things back for these communities. And we had some conclusions that I'm going to get to. So we decided to say, if you have a build it back better, let's truly build it back better. Instead of looking at the current building code and requirements from the federal side, how far could we take this? What is the best guidance out there from all around the world to bring it together and build a house that encompasses and embraces all of those elements? And instead of building just for the next Sandy, let's build for all hazards. And let's look at the social economic side of this to make sure that Diane, who is now retired with a fixed income, can live out her years in a place that she feels safe, sleep well at night, and have enough economy and money to support herself. So this was the beginning of our journey with the demonstration house. I'm going to run through a few typical resources that you can find out there. There's a lot of guidance, and guidance is pre-code. This is typically what's put out there that is going to be included in future cycles, but it also incorporates best practices. Yes, I have to have X and Y, such as a door and a window. I have to meet the code to a certain degree, but what if I go beyond code? What are the consequences of that? And what is the surety of that? So you can find this at the AIA website for the Hurricane Ready, or go to Federal Alliance of Safe Homes for the Resilient Design Guides. These are 2 of the sources that we had. We also worked with the IBHS, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So this is an interesting group, because if you build to their standard and you receive, similar to a LEED certification, you receive a fortified home and a gold certification for the roof, you're rewarded with a lower insurance rating for wind. And if you build a fortified structure, you have the opportunity to lower substantially many of your insurance ratings and costs. So it's another one of our partners, another one of the elements that we brought to this project. And then, of course, we delved into the FEMA library deeply. It was, as Bob mentioned, I work with federal agencies from time to time, and well aware and use a lot of the FEMA guidance, and have contributed to some of the guidance. So here's the FEMA P55, the Coastal Construction Manual. It's a great piece to get involved with. And then the Home Builder's Guide for Coastal Construction, something we went over with our builder. and some of the practices that are in there for best practices and why. And then of course, the latest that had come out for New York City is a good example. New York City had the retrofit of buildings for flood risk. And then of course, inside it really details every typology inside the city of New York and how you approach it. It's a really great piece that I recommend anyone who's working in coastal areas to take a look at. And then of course, one of the last ones I'll share with you, and there were many, by the way. This is one of the other ones is really the Climate Resilience Design Guidelines from New York City. This was put together over the last several years. I helped write the first iteration of this. And what this is about is really looking at the projections of climate change and incorporating those into your design process. And so that is, it's great information to get a hold of. Now I'm going to talk about the atypical partners. So in doing this kind of work, you have to have an idea that collaboration and the idea that you are a piece of the puzzle when you're trying to do something of this scale. And again, this is a small house, but I mean scale is bringing along something that is incorporating the best guidance out there and synergizing it. So we have the main partners were my office, Federal Alliance Safe Homes, and PCA Corporation, or PCA, the Portland Cement Association. And then you have the contributing partners that are listed here, and then the material donors / partners. What that means is it's not material per se in the physical sense. This is once we selected how we are going to build this house, the outreach to these groups and companies so they would give us technical support to make sure that the contractor understood how to do the work, how it synergized between the different types of materials and different types of construction, how that would come together, and then how this would all be tested. And if the assemblies had not been tested before, how could we as a team get these tested as new assemblies rather than burdening the client for that? But how does this become something that adds to the vocabulary of all architects and all engineers and all construction in the future? That brings us to the beginning of the design of the house. So now back to this idea of four-dimensional resilience, or 4 dimensions. So the house, what we wanted to build and convince Diane that we are going to give her house back, but we're going to give her a house that will last the test of time, is that we wanted to make sure that this was a passive house for temperature and power conditions, as well as it could withstand all wind and water shocks and stresses, and also the test of time, that this would have a life cycle based on a 100-year life cycle. But what she brought to the table is something that we often talk about as architects, or talk about in our office, is this idea of social resilience and social currency. You see, Diane, even as she grew up there, she's become sort of the center of the neighborhood. The hub of her little tiny bungalow house was a place where anybody could come anytime. She would bring her neighbors together, have cookouts, celebrations. She would do bake sales, you name it. And she wanted to have that back. She wanted to have a place that was welcoming for everyone, and to begin again to have this hub of the neighborhood, because that's her social currency. That's her economy. And the other thing is, she was very much an advocate for, she said, okay, if you're going to convince me to do a resilient house, a resilient, sustainable house, it doesn't have to look weird, does it? And she used the word weird. And of course, these types of constructions, as you know, design professionals, they don't have to look different. They just have to perform differently. So she wanted something that really still fit into the beach community and was something that she could be very, very comfortable with. So this is the brief layout of the house. And it's a very small house. It's 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. She grew up in a house with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and essentially a dining area with a kitchen and a living room. The original house was around 900 square feet. The final house is just under 1,200 square feet. She decided to build back a little bit of a bigger house, and she had to pay for that out of pocket, aside from the federal side of the federal dollars supporting this. But the other thing I want you to look at here is the upper and lower decks. She wanted to have a place where she could have this social currency to bring the neighborhood together for various pieces. And once you know the neighborhood, there's a reason you have upper and lower decks in the front and the back. There's a main street in the front, which is only a pedestrian way. And in the back is really the alleyway where everyone brings their cars and parks, but the rear is where the rear yard is. So we incorporated that all into the design. And then we looked at this idea of 4-dimensional resilience, and it went all the way through. So with these diagrams, I'm just going to show you a few pieces of it. And in the performance of this house, we looked at using an ICF block construction. So this is an all concrete house with concrete roofing tile from Eagle Roofing Tile. And we also have, it's elevated well above the required floodplain. We actually went as high as we could go. Usually 2 foot of freeboard is what's required, but we went much higher. There was a backup generator. We used helix in the concrete mix to reduce the amount of steel that's pictured up there in the upper left. Simpson strong tie spray foam insulation to make sure that the roof could meet a passive house standard, as well as be the stiffener for high wind events. And it goes on and on. Some of the other elements, the thermal envelope with the spray foam insulation and the ICF is reinforced with radiant floors and keeps this house comfortably warm or comfortably cool, depending on the time of year. And then this is very interesting for you folks in California. This was built in a fire zone, and we were required to put sprinklers into this house, even though we built basically a 4-hour fire rated non-combustible construction. The entire house is non-combustible, and sprinklers are added just because of the code. And we couldn't convince the city otherwise to save the money based on that. So it has a lot of redundancy. This takes us to a couple of currency impacts. So one, you'll see that this is during the build process. To the upper right, a few folks are working with FEMA. They want to remain anonymous, but basically said using the federally funded Build It Back program, plus Lab Architects, changed the rules and the future of building. They've come out and said that on many occasions, but the Mayor's Office of Resilience here in New York City, they often tab this construction as the next generation of housing and have formally adopted this house as the next generation of housing for New York City, creating a further series of currency and an economy. Again, here in the upper right, Heather Reuter from New York City's Emergency Management. This is the first house that is now looked at as a potential shelter in place by emergency management and the federal authority. It's built to a FEMA 361 shelter in place standard. The entire shell of the house is, and even though Diane will not stay there, she will evacuate when ordered to. The city is ready to, and FEMA is ready to come and examine this house after a disaster, if a disaster does occur, to see what had happened to the house, to see if it actually stands up to a shelter-in-place standard that is fast becoming something that this country needs badly. So this brings us to the sort of summary of this house for what was built. And I've listed a lot of these things about non-combustible construction, so it's almost a fireproof construction. And it has a thermal envelope and passive house, meets a passive house standard. And it does have a backup generator in case the grid goes down. And then of course, impact resistance for wind and water, for doors, windows, skylights, the siding, the roof, all of those pieces. And here's the thing where we start talking about economy. So we have the social economy we discussed, the economy and currency that we've created around the house with the city agencies and others. But when you look at the flood elevation and all that we did to this house, we reduced her premium by 83% for flood insurance alone. So that ROI over a 10-year period, she's going to save $34,000 just in the flood insurance piece. That doesn't include the other insurances she has out there, which have similar reductions. But then in terms of the resilience of this building and its operation, as I said, it just needs to perform differently. So there's the interior of the house all the way to the right. But when we're looking through the blower door test and getting her rating, she's now, after a 1 year of occupancy, she has an average of $42 a month for heating, cooling, and lighting. Versus the old house was at $280 a month. So she's 10 years savings based on the old house to the new house, and the new house is bigger, is another $28,000. So we're starting to see how some of those things work. And in fact, if you look at the ROI on a lot of the efforts, including all the insurances and those pieces, it becomes quite high, and a place where you can begin to say, I can build better and it'll pay for itself. So here's some of the elements shown for the interior: the passive lighting, the high ceilings with the fans, impact rated skylights. You can see the sprinklers and the rated windows. And the exterior, you can see some of the other pieces, such as the backup generator, crawl space access below, the flood vents, everything. And it's of note that we also have lightning protection that's incorporated into this house. When I say all hazard, it is all hazard. Lightning strikes the Breezy Point area quite often. And it was one thing that most of the people in the neighborhood were saying, why would you do that? That's crazy. You don't need to spend your money on that. But as it turns out, when you look at the risk of lightning strike and the history of lightning strikes in that neighborhood, it was well worth putting it in. So here's a shot of the final house right before the house was turned over to Diane. And you can see there's the ribbon cutting again. And we were very fortunate to have this as part of the AIA Film Challenge, or the seed film. They really talked about the real story behind this house. And of interest in this photograph are a lot of those partners that I mentioned to begin with. In the lower right, that's John and Gargiola from FEMA. You can see myself there with Diane and Leslie Chapman Henderson from Flash. See the folks from PCA and people from the city agencies and all over the place. We've given tours of this to anyone who wants to come and see the house. And we've made the drawings available online for download. But what we've come to with this house is that, resilience has to be it has to be recognizable to people. It can't be something like a foreign object. We also want to espouse that resilience and has to be cost effective, and that it's accessible to everyone. It can't go the way of the early sustainability movement. And many of you know what I mean. Sustainability was looked at as something for those people over there, or an extra cost, an extra layer. Resilience can't go that way. It's a human right. You have to be able to sleep in your bed knowing at night, knowing that you're comfortable and safe. And we as architects and associated professionals can provide that for folks. But we begin to ask ourselves at the end of this, did we regenerate the community? Because if you look at this, no other house in the neighborhood, or at least in the near neighborhood, is compliant with even the moniker of elevation to flooding. So the next storm that comes, will those folks be safe, and will she lose community in the end? So what's the social currency? Well, here it is over on the right. This was earlier, or at the end of last year. Said, we have a power outage. Guess whose house is the only one lit on my block? Thank you for the generator. And I responded, Diane, that's great news. It's going to get cold out there because it was getting cold. Stay warm. Great to hear that Kohler came through and they hooked it up after their final test with the city of New York. And so what she did, and is not shown here, is that she invited all of her neighbors and she actually had a party. While their houses were getting cold and dark, she opened her house up and she had some 55 people in her house. Now that's community. The other outcomes of this were the fact that the impact of this is ongoing. I was invited to talk with FEMA, to the recovery office, and have passed information along, worked with some of the building science folks with this ongoing work to make our buildings better. As I said, the city of New York adopted this as the next generation of housing. I joined the building building energy exchange on their advisory board to really look at the gap in when we look at becoming sustainable cities. Most of the governance is around large buildings or multifamily buildings. Very little of it has been around smaller buildings. At least that's the story on the East Coast. I know in California it's different, but this is a huge gap. The largest energy consumer turned out to be low-rise buildings, and so now we're tackling that. The New York State, NYSERDA is the energy authority for the state. Also has been working. I've been working with them on some of their energy profiling and some of the things as part of an architecture advisory board. And at the federal side, we changed federal policy. And what Bob had mentioned from the beginning is I'm part of a HUD new housing regulation task force that really looks at resilient housing methodologies and building practices for builders all across the U.S. So that's some currency. And now we're going to take you to the next story. The next story is about how do you regenerate culture. So Diane showed us something about culture pretty rapidly here. And this is sort of the other end of the spectrum. And I want you to remember the word coup de main, which is here on the slide. So after the hurricane season of 2017, Hurricane Maria had slammed through most of the Caribbean, including the island of Dominica in the Lesser Antilles. And that's me in Dominica taking a look at and helping out, responding to this disaster. And remember, think of resilience as an action. So I've gone down there and started to work with people. And we asked ourselves, are we going to be replacing housing, or are we going to regenerate communities? And the idea is that we're going to regenerate a community. So here's where we're working in Dominica. So this is the island. The island has less than 100,000 people for the entire nation. And this part is the Kalinago territory. The Kalinago are the first people of the island. They're also the poorest indigenous group in the Caribbean per capita. And they're the largest single indigenous group in the Caribbean, 3,500 people in the Kalinago territory that call that home. And it's quite a beautiful place. So going there, we realized something, that there's a housing policy on the island that's aimed to fail. That's one of our challenges. Another one of the challenges is that the common building practice is foreign to the island, as you see on the left, and the locals have always been encouraged to abandon local knowledge. Yet, on the right, everyone knows how to build. That house is over 80 years old and has survived not just Hurricane Maria, a direct hit, has survived multiple shocks and stresses, many storms that have come through the island. And we talked to the multi-generational owners all the way back to the great-grandparents, and they said it was their great-grandparents that had built it. And it's been there for generation after generation after generation and survived those storms. So how do you decode and enhance and take on local knowledge? The other thing we recognize that the current model is all around the world, that we look at sort of a maintenance economy model, that when a disaster strikes a community, it's linear. We react. We base it on replacement, just like the Build It Back program in New York was, build it back. You're right, we're gonna build it back. The goal is to return life to what it was like before the disaster, but did anyone ask if life was sustainable or equitable before the disaster? So we come to the conclusion that this is a flawed model, and we have to break this cycle. We often look at responding to disasters or looking at building resilient capacity as hard, which is what you build, soft, how you educate, proactive, what you do before the disaster, and reactive, what we do after the disaster. And it's quite often that we do these three things, and we often leave that fourth thing out. So we also recognize that in Dominica, they lost 80% of their housing in one storm, 80% island-wide. All the subsistence farming and agroforestry were devastated, which destroyed what little economy there was in the Kalinago. This is one of the community meetings that we have, and there on the left is my friend Nietzsche, Louis Patrick Hill. He's on the Kalinago Council, and someone who I continue to work with today. And so listening and learning and understanding the needs of this community brought us to this notion that is embedded in their culture called coup de main. It means we all pull together. The currency that they deal with is how they all work together to achieve common goals. It is not about money, it is not about land, it is not about object. It is about how you achieve common goals, or if it's an individual goal, that you can rely on everyone to come and help you. It's beautiful, but I've seen it in action. The other thing is that examining that the buildings that survived, such as the Moina there on the top right, is based on traditional building methods from a climactic and culturally sensitive past, and those should be considered. In fact, some of the housing, this is one of the three housing prototypes that we put together at the request of CREED, which is the island government, funded by the World Bank. By responding and listening to culture and learning from cultural places and being surgical about where we can put new housing, we looked at how we can have impact into regenerating the Kalinago territory by using local talent, local materials. So what we learned in Diane's house from all of that work, we bring to this project: continuous load paths, understanding that we use all the climactic and shocks and stresses for an all hazard response, rainwater capture in a cistern, using biogas for fuel, and using PV panels, storm shutters, all the things to make this as resilient in this climate as we can, similar to what we did with Diane's house. The other thing we did was we trained 7 building crews down there. And it's very simple. What we said was that everybody already knows how to build. And what we did was we introduced them to a few different new techniques that added to their already amazing vocabulary of building. So rebuilding locally, using local knowledge, community hands, using the idea of coup de main, has brought us to this place that the EU said, hey, you guys are doing great. They funded 50 new homes being built using local labor and local materials. And the next piece of this story is really talking with the keeper of history, the people who are really the fathers and mothers and keepers of this culture and legacy alive. This is Miranda, and she taught me a great deal about the Kalinago culture. There's a uniqueness of place in the Kalinago and Dominica that has to do with mythology, history, and building practice that led to a series of designs that the community has accepted. And these designs going forward have now been presented to governing bodies for culturally resilient places and hubs. So the new model that we've put forward is called the KIGR model, which is the Kalinago Institute for Global Resilience and Regeneration. And this is to regenerate an economy or create a healing economy within the local territory. It's circular and expanding, and it's also proactive. It's that fourth piece that nobody takes on. So we look at what potential shocks and stresses there are, and if they do come, then you're looking at repair plus regeneration rather than a linear process. The goal is to surgically invest in high impact initiators that already exist in the territory that jumpstart regeneration that is expansive, whether that's agroforestry, agropharma, whatever it may be. The goal is to express the uniqueness of place and people in this island and other islands, and repair the earth and regenerate biocapacity while we do it. So this is our new model that we've espoused, and we've started this institute in the Kalinago territory, and cultural regeneration is key. We've identified the DNA of resilience that already exists in the Kalinago people. Our board of directors is over 51% Kalinagan, and the rest of us are scientists, architects, and people from banking and finance, education from all over the world. And we are pledging to make sure that this part of the island leads in this idea of regeneration with all of these pieces at play. And to that end, we went to the Clinton Global Initiative to express some of the ideas and interests. We caught the eye of the Commonwealth of Nations. Dominica is one of the 47 countries of the Commonwealth of Nations. We made a presentation in London of all of this idea of work, along with Nietzsche and several members of the Kalinago Council, to make sure that this work continues, but it elevates and then can be exported as an idea to other islands and nations and places around the world, to note that resilience and sustainability are not enough. You have to go to regeneration. And this is an image of one of the resilience hubs. It's a cultural resilient hub that is going to be built in Sevilla, one of the main villages in the Kalinago territory. And that's me chatting with Chief Frederick over some of the issues and some of the elements that are culturally relevant and significant to drive this community forward. So that brings me to the last story, and this is a short story because I realize I only have about 5 minutes left. And it's really good because I only have about a 5-minute story. And this is our latest story. So as you can see, the Kalinago territory, we brought a lot of what we learned from Diane, and we brought it to the Kalinago territory. And if I take you back one slide, this is something that Chief Frederick said: we are not invisible. And what he meant by that is that the Kalinago people have been pushed to the corner of the island since colonization. Yet they are not invisible, they refuse to be invisible. So fast forward to Ohana, which is about family. It's making the invisible visible. This is our newest story. And this takes place in Hawaii, the North Shore of Oahu. And our work in the Kalinago was seen by some members of the Hau'alua community. This is a community of 7 villages of about 7,000 Native Hawaiians. And they sent me a letter to my office. The letter was delivered. It was beautifully written, asking if me and my team would come and see this community and talk with them and help them. And it was a beautiful letter. The funny thing is they didn't put any contact information on the letter, only the address, but no phone, no email, no anything. So it took us a little while, but we tracked down everyone and talked to Dottie, who's there in the middle, Fran on the right there. And we reached out and said, well, I'm going to be in Hawaii. It just so happened I was giving a presentation to AIA Honolulu, and I was already scheduled to go. And this letter had come about 2 months in advance. And so I decided to extend my stay. And after working with AIA Hawaii or Honolulu, took some time to work with this community. And this is the greeting ceremony for me and my team arriving and seeing a piece of the island. They're looking for a resilience hub, a community resilience hub, culturally significant, noting that that part of the island is one of the most vulnerable places in the United States with the population that they have, as well as sea level rise and the current conditions that make it very hard to live during times of the year when the tides are very high or storms are coming through. So this is a shot of one of the historic sites. We're there with one of the archaeological department from the island, folks from FEMA, and here's our initial concept for the island, or for this area of the island, looking at a resilience hub that incorporates many of the things that they've been looking for. But here's the economy thing of it, and this is my second to last slide. What we looked at is culturally, the image all the way on the right, that is an apuaha. An apuaha is a water course that's highly manipulated historically by Hawaiians, that has a series of cascading water courses that grow food all the way down to a catchment pool, and the catchment pool is where you farm fish. The Hawaiians have been doing this for thousands of years. And this is a restored apuaha on Kauai. And we went and visited, talked with the folks over there, the Conservancy and the Parks Department, and realized that we can do the same thing using our buildings and the site that's being donated to the community to create an apuaha in the contemporary sense to help regenerate culture and cultural practice. And so the Community Resilience Hub is for the entire region of Kualoa, and the 100 Resilient Cities Action Plan for Hawaii calls for these types of resilience hubs to be built on the island. This will be the first one built in the state of Hawaii. In helping them to become visible, they had been told that they were invisible for 20 years. So becoming visible, we have now got them on the state funding. They're in the current budget for $2.75 million as initial funding. The CARES Act just came through. We were awarded $350,000 for community resilience training that begin this month. And we've been put in as one of the AGR 400 communities. AGR 400 is 400 communities around the world that are practicing regenerative practices. And so we've been identified as a community that is now on that radar. So what this means is that BRIC funding is coming up. BRIC funding is through FEMA, and FEMA does a 3-to-1 match. So the state funding at $2.75 million, if that goes through with the BRIC funding, would be another almost $9 million added to the project. So we are no longer invisible. That's what Dottie says, Fran, everyone says. No longer invisible, that's right, because this is gonna go forward. It's the currency we've created with the goodwill of the community and advancing these aspects based on the knowledge that we have working with the federal government, understanding where we can leverage these things, but also decode for these communities how they can get involved in these processes and become successful. And this is the We Are Now Visible. This is a visioning of the Resilience Hub currently on that site. We have some listening sessions to the community coming up once again this month. I'm sorry, next month in November. And we'll continue this work, and we hope that this will break ground sometime next year. And we'll see what it ends up looking like and being. So that's going to bring you to the conclusion. We have a lot of more stories. Look, every dot on there was a story. So I'm more than happy to tell you about more stories. Ask me about any of them, because quite frankly, it's now up to you. I need you to define what your currency is. So when we talk about economy, could my office make more money? Yes. Would that increase our currency? No. For me, it's important that people that work in my office understand what social impact design is, and we embody it, because we all sleep well at night. We do good work for a lot of good people and people who need us. We are working for the other 98%, and we're working for them or with them 110% of the time. So with that, I'm going to bring this to an end and stop sharing my screen. And I thank you all very much for listening in.
Illya, that was fabulous. What a great presentation. I'm going to start my video here if I can, just so you can see me. Yeah. So I'm just impressed with your efforts and just you're an inspiration for us that all want to do good. So let's open it up for some Q&A. And if you have any questions, if there are questions that kind of continue to come, we will provide additional resources that will give you answers to those questions that we're unable to answer. And we'll provide additional resources on the Climate Action webpage. So check back there. Just a reminder, type any questions you may have in the Q&A box located at the lower or upper menu and bar in your Zoom window. And I see, Illya, we've got several questions right in there already. So people continue to ask questions, and as Illya tends to respond.
Sure. So I'll just take them in order here. First one is from Nathan Wilson. Can PV panels and smart energy management batteries take the place of proposed? Yes, they can. So excellent question. Thanks, Nathan. So here's the shortcomings on Diane's house. We are in a contextual design, or we're in Breezy Point, which has its own zoning covenant. We originally wanted to put solar panels on the roof. There are no solar panels in Breezy Point, and we could not get them to change their covenant of restriction to allow us to put solar panels on the roof. And since then, there's some great companies down in South Florida that have solar generators, deployable solar generators. And just because of our curiosity, who makes these? And now we know who makes them. And so, yes, absolutely. The other thing is they wouldn't allow us rainwater harvesting in that neighborhood because, hey, you're in sandy soil. Why would you want to harvest water was constantly the question from the cooperative. And Diane grows some of her own food because she likes to garden. They wouldn't allow us to hold water because it was against the regulation. So there was a lot of things that we would love to advance on that project, but there's some things that you've got to pick your battles. But thanks for the question. Next one, anonymous intended. Can you perhaps expand a bit more on the federal and HUD housing regulations that were changed as a result of the housing? Yes. So from the federal side, FEMA has taken this on as a case study and a best case scenario. Now it's considered a best practice. So when you go to the FEMA site, you'll see as the best practice and how it's followed. From the HUD side, they've taken that house and now on that HUD task force, incorporating some of those things as minimum standards for better housing. Because we've proven that, yes, it does cost more. It cost about 10% more to build that house than what the federal dollar was to replace the house that to the current code. So what does 10% give you, and the return on investment when you go to passive standard as well as insurance savings? And you can prove that you can pay for it and it's economical or cost effective for the federal side. So they're interested in that. And now we're about 8 months into this work. You should be seeing some guidance coming out based on that very, very soon. Ian Merker, longtime friend. Hi, Ian. Good to see you or hear from you. What do the commercial and essential services buildings look like in these vulnerable communities? Is there any synergy between the resilient, regenerative, residential community hub designs, and yes, yeah, great. And commercial civic functions, yes. So there are two parts of that. One, some of the guidance, I showed you the residential side and now the community resilience hubs. The Fortified has a commercial side to it. So if you're doing a lot of commercial work, you can get the rate reduction and a lot of other things that are out there for commercial. I just chose not to show those today. With those resilience hub, the community resilient hub in the Colorado territory is a multifunction facility that has education, entrepreneurial startups, and some other elements that do play into some of the commercial side. It's much more of a rural small village community. And the one in Hawaii that we're going through the visioning now does have some of that, but it's more about agro. They have a food distribution as well as a food desert issue. And so part of that site is going to be breadfruit trees. And they want to teach people how to maintain their own yards and gardens to provide food for themselves, because it's some of the poorest people in our country that live on that North Shore. So there are some commercial aspects to it, but not the same that you might think of. They could be incorporated in if that community did reflect they needed that. Did you mention blower door test? No, I did not, but yes, we did a blower door test. We passed with flying colors. I can get you the data on it. We were one of the tightest blower doors that had been done. We had New Jersey Institute of Technology as one of our partners. They brought graduate students, did the blower door tests for us. And then, of course, the city did a blower door test as well. And we did find where we needed to improve based on the blower door test, and where the construction needed to be tightened up and shored up. So that was really, really great. It seems a 3D printed concrete home may be the house of the future, especially here in California. Maybe. Also, you found that roundhouses do better with winter. Yes, yeah. So abrupt changes in geometry are always places where wind pressure, as well as flying embers, may find a place. And so you may find that kind of shape benefits you in a lot of ways. So you can, Diane's house, there were some things that we would have changed about the roof to get it as aerodynamic as possible, but we had to make some trade-offs, right? So yes, those were all really great questions. Other questions? Did I miss a couple? I think there's some other ones here in the chat. Nasrin, is there a link for the download? Yeah, I can send you guys a link for the download. You basically fill out a request for it, and then we send it along to you. And basically what we're asking is, go ahead and use this as a platform for learning and sharing. If you create a new house based on this platform, please pay that forward. We can't enforce that, but we ask that you pay that forward. So you innovate on that platform, my pleasure, go for it. But now share it with more people. If we have millions upon millions of people that are in these circumstances, whether it's fire, flood, whatever it is, we have to make sure that this information gets out there, that every architect, engineer, builder understands that they can do something much, much better. So yeah, I can send that along. Let's see, PDF of the presentation. Yes, that's being done. I think that's already answered. Anything else? Do you see anything on there, Bob?
Well, I think you've got it. And Illya, I'm super impressed. You've been able to hold everybody's attention. I don't think we've lost anybody. I see 94 participants still hanging in there. So it's a tribute to you and your presentation style. So thank you so much. And those of the 93 that have made it so far, you'll be getting, we'll be submitting for the AIA continuing education credits, and it should appear in your transcript in about 2 weeks. So really a huge, huge thank you to you. And just again, I'm so impressed with the work you're doing, and really a good role model for all of us. So, and as always, we have more resources and tools that can be found on the AIA California's website, which is aiacalifornia.org/climate-action. And thank you again for joining us today. And we'll see you all next month for Designing for Equitable Communities. Thank you all, and thanks, Illya. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Bob, and best of luck to everybody. You know, you don't do these things alone, and want to make sure that I had a lot of help doing all this work, and I continue to have a lot of help. And you know, by the way, we're hiring, so so have a great one, and appreciate the opportunity to share some of our stories.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.